While the world remains gripped in the conflicts currently being waged in Ukraine and Gaza, there exists a lesser known but no less important conflict being fought in a region rarely discussed by mainstream media: France and Russia's bloody struggle for Africa. Over the past decade, Russian-backed mercenary group Wagner has steadily expanded across the continent. The private military contractor has set up shop across the Sahel region in Mali, Burkina Faso, the Central African Republic, Libya, Chad, Sudan, and most recently, Niger. This dramatic shift coincides with a string of military coups across the region in Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, where the former French colonies have expelled French forces and denounced their presence. The use of Wagner to bring stability by combating rebel and jihadist groups, grain donations to nations facing food shortages, cooperation on energy projects, and the offer of favorable trade terms means Russia is now winning hearts and minds across Africa. In Mali, polls show that 84% of the population has a positive view of Russia. A 2020 poll of young Africans showed a 68% favorable opinion of Russia, compared to just 57% for France. Across the region, the French tricolor is being torn down and replaced with its Russian counterpart as the last remnants of France's colonial empire slip away from its grasp. So what led to this rapid collapse of French influence in its former colonial territories and Russia's rapid rise to take its place? To explain the current situation, it helps to understand the Sahel region's history and how it connects with France's astonishingly exploitative colonial past in Africa. The Sahel spans the length of Africa from Senegal in the west to Eritrea in the east, forming a transition zone between the Sahara Desert to the north and the tropical savanna to the south. Between the 9th and 18th centuries, the region generated massive wealth thanks to the trans-Saharan trade routes transporting gold, ivory, salt, and slaves from the resource-rich south to Europe and North Africa. However, starting in the 15th century, European traders opened new maritime trading routes, bypassing the inland trade routes including Timbuktu and leading to a long and steady economic decline of the Sahel region over the following centuries. As European maritime trade flourished, so did its colonial expansion into Africa. France, along with other colonial powers, carved up Africa between them with little regard for its existing ethnic, tribal, and religious groups. The scramble for Africa, as it became known, was a mad dash to acquire as many natural resources from the continent as possible. Between 1880 and 1913, the French colonial empire rapidly expanded from Algeria, Senegal, and a small portion of the Congo to a vast territory spanning Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, West Africa, including most of the Sahel region, and Madagascar. However, these vast holdings did not last long. Following World War II, much of France's African holdings were occupied by foreign forces. While they regained control over many of these territories, a decolonization movement began with uprisings in Algeria, Cameroon, and Madagascar. These uprisings were violently repressed by French forces, leading to massive loss of life among the local populations. These events, along with a shift in popular sentiment in France against colonialism, led to a new system designed to retain the benefits of colonialism through more covert means. Instead of dominating its colonies with the butt of a rifle, France would now rule with a more opaque tool: the banknote. The new neocolonial system was known as Francafrique. In 1945, France created a new currency, the CFA franc, which its colonies were compelled to adopt. The CFA franc was pegged to the French franc at a fixed exchange rate of 2-to-1. CFA nations were also required to deposit half of their foreign exchange reserves with the French treasury to ensure the convertibility guarantee. These measures ensured that the CFA remained overvalued, crippling the export competitiveness of CFA nations and offering France a massive economic advantage in trade. While the CFA franc system did offer some benefits to members in lowering inflation rates when compared with other African nations, its primary purpose was creating a massive wealth transfer from the former French colonies to Paris. As would be expected, not all former French colonies were happy with this arrangement. In 1958, following a string of uprisings, France granted independence to its former colonies with the expectation that they join the French community going forward. Of the former colonies, only Guinea voted for immediate independence and a rejection of continued security and economic cooperation with France. The nation's leader, Sékou Touré, famously declared, "Guinea prefers poverty in freedom to riches in slavery." In retaliation for voting against supposed voluntary cooperation, the French demolished much of the nation's infrastructure, including destroying sewage pipes, dismantling the power grid, burning medicine, and even smashing light bulbs. When Guinea turned towards the Soviet Union for support, France launched Operation Persil, an attempt to destabilize the country through economic sabotage. They flooded the nation with forged banknotes to create hyperinflation and even armed opposition paramilitaries to spark a coup. These efforts ultimately failed to overthrow Sékou Touré's government, and in fact had the opposite effect, exposing France's usage of underhanded means to achieve its objectives. Following independence in 1960, to maintain control over Francafrique, France launched over 50 military interventions across Africa to protect its puppet regimes. This included providing vast military assistance to Hissène Habré, the president of Chad, convicted and sentenced to life in prison for crimes against humanity, torture, and war crimes. It also included massive aid and direct military intervention on behalf of Mobutu Sese Seko, the longtime dictator of Zaire, who in addition to human rights abuses directly siphoned off up to 50% of the nation's capital budget into his pockets. As might be expected, this pattern of behavior has not endeared France to the people across its former colonies. This wasn't entirely unexpected though. In 2007, French President Jacques Chirac stated, "Don't forget one thing, and that is that a large portion of the money that we have in our purses comes precisely from the exploitation of Africa over the centuries. So we need a little measure of good sense, I didn't say generosity, but good sense and justice to render to Africans, I would say, what we took from them. This is necessary if we want to avoid the most severe turmoil and difficulty with all the political consequences that this will bring in the near future." The African backlash against France has been swift and relentless. In 2021, a convoy of French troops passing through Burkina Faso and Niger was repeatedly blockaded by protesters. In 2022, protesters attacked the French embassy in Burkina Faso's capital for supposedly harboring its ousted leader. Calls to abolish the CFA franc are growing louder as anti-French sentiment escalates across the region. Protesters frequently target French politicians, and French interventions are viewed as ineffective and corrupt, often backing brutal dictators who serve France's interests rather than their own people. Couple this with an explosion of anti-French sentiment in Mali, where a 2021 coup led by Colonel Assimi Goïta expelled the 1,000 remaining French troops, as well as the ambassador, and you have a sudden power vacuum across the Sahel. It's into this vacuum that Russia and its PMC Wagner forces have stepped in. Seen by many as an anti-imperial and anti-colonial alternative to the Francafrique system, Wagner has been welcomed with open arms. In Mali, Wagner forces began arriving en masse in 2021, with a peak of 2,000 troops in the country operating as a counterterrorism, training, and security force. Unlike the French, who were seen by many as combat-shy and too soft in their counterterrorism approach, Wagner had no hesitation mixing it up with jihadist forces. Following a series of deadly attacks on military bases in late 2003, Wagner, alongside with the Malian military, launched an offensive against Tuareg rebels in the north towards Kindal, a major rebel stronghold. The offensive successfully captured the rebel-held settlements of Tessalit, Agualok, Anafif, Kindal, and Inafarak. They were then ambushed by Tuareg forces around Tinzuaten, leading to a fierce 3-day battle where Wagner lost between 20 and 80 men, according to Russian sources. It should be noted that the private military contractor has received criticism for being overly aggressive in its counterterrorism operations, especially in the early days of its development, where a policy of executing suspects caused widespread outrage. Despite the controversy, Wagner's operations continue to yield results, reinforcing its presence across the Sahel. And the same pattern can be seen across the Sahel, almost as if Russia has put together a successful playbook for African operations and is running it again and again. In Burkina Faso, following a series of coups in 2022, new President Ibrahim Traoré took over. While he initially publicly denied any Russian military involvement, in January of this year, 100 Wagner troops arrived in the nation under the rebranded Africa Corps banner, and another 200 are expected to join them shortly. The same strategy can be observed in the Central African Republic, Sudan, Chad, Niger, and Libya. So what does Russia gain from this involvement? While Wagner and its successor, the Africa Corps, charge fees for their services, this is not Russia's primary purpose in Africa. The use of Wagner allows Russia to gain geopolitical influence through fairly low-cost ventures. Deploying several hundred to several thousand troops when needed is a low-cost venture for Russia, but offers the opportunity for asymmetric gains. Russia strengthens its position as a power broker across the Sahel, a region geopolitically important due to its proximity to NATO's southern flank. Furthermore, the Sahel region is rich in resources such as oil, minerals, and gold. In many cases, Wagner secures control over these resources in lieu of direct payment, benefiting the Russian economy. Of particular interest is the establishment of port and naval base access in the Red Sea and Mediterranean. Should Russia succeed in establishing a significant naval presence on the Red Sea coast, it could facilitate the export of Sahelian resources, particularly gold, directly to Dubai, one of the world's largest gold exchanges. Additionally, Russia gains new export trade partners, primarily for its arms and grain markets. The nation is now Africa's #1 arms supplier, controlling 49% of the continent's arms trade. While Russia's actions are undoubtedly driven by self-interest, and it tends to play up the anti-colonial and particularly anti-French sentiment across the continent, this doesn't mean there aren't mutual benefits for both sides. African nations are rightly seeking a fair and mutually beneficial partner for trade and security. Following the last 60 years of France's neocolonial exploitation and overall failure to provide security, it's no surprise that many are turning to the only alternative offering a more equal and cooperative relationship. Ultimately, France has no one but themselves to blame for the current situation. People will only tolerate exploitation in exchange for security so long as there is no alternative. And now that an alternative has arrived, however imperfect, the era of Francafrique has come to a swift end. While the West decries Russia's growing presence in Africa as manipulative and propaganda-driven, the reality is that Africans increasingly welcome this shift. Peace, economic stability, and the opportunity for a better life are things all people desire. And if that's what Russia is offering, then it's no surprise many African nations are happy to accept. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and watching one of these 2 videos next.